She was neither man, nor woman, nor ghost, and yet the palace called her nothing at all. Fragment from a suppressed Persian court manuscript, circa 458 BC. You're standing at the edge of the empire, where sand tastes like salt and blood, and the horizon burns crimson under a sun that has witnessed too many secrets. The walls rise before you, massive, sun-scorched, humming with silence. You hear it before you see it. A whisper, low and trembling, scraping the stone like a prayer that never reaches the gods. Footsteps echo behind closed doors. Not the proud stomps of kings or the delicate steps of courtesans, no. These are hushed. Controlled. Practiced. You pass through a corridor where air does not move, and time has gone stiff with waiting. Incense burns from a distant alcove, thick and suffocating. Rosewater, crushed myrrh, and something else, something iron, something red. The scent clings to your skin like guilt. Tapestries hang like veils across each doorway, shielding what the empire refuses to name. Then you see her. She is kneeling, motionless, as servants pass by without acknowledgement. Her head is bowed not in prayer, but in erasure. Her body wrapped in silk, her mouth stitched with silence. She does not flinch. She does not speak. She does not bleed anymore. You think she might be a servant, a concubine, perhaps a priestess, until you notice the absence. Not just the absence of voice, or name, or history, but the absence inside her. A hollowing. A removal. The kind inflicted with cold metal and no mercy. She was once a girl. But in this palace, her womanhood was seen as liability, then as threat, so they carved it out and left her something in between. The guards do not look at her. The scribes do not write of her. The empire never said her name out loud. And yet, she is everywhere. In the shadows of the court. In the silence between royal decrees. In the punishments that never make it to parchment. You've heard of eunuchs before. The castrated men who served kings, advised queens, guarded harems. Their names survive, trusted, feared, remembered. But what if some were not men? What if history, too ashamed or too afraid, simply changed the pronoun, and looked away? She is not legend. She is not myth. She is fact, buried beneath centuries of shame. This isn't just about gender. It's about a machine of power so immense it could unwrite people as easily as it wrote conquests. It's about silence as a weapon. It's about those who were mutilated not for crimes, but for convenience. And it's about how history chose to forget the women who were cut, cloaked, and converted into instruments of empire. This is the history they tried to erase. The empire was not built in daylight. It rose under moonlight, silent, deliberate, draped in silk and shadows. Stone by stone, the Achaemenid dynasty laid its bones across the earth, stretching from the banks of the Indus to the edge of the Aegean. Persia did not conquer, it absorbed. Cultures, tongues, gods, and people. Especially people. Within these golden halls, emperors wore crowns like curses and spoke through others. They didn't touch the world directly. They issued commands through intermediaries, clean hands directing bloody work. And at the heart of that machinery stood the eunuchs. You've read about them before. Or perhaps you haven't. Either way, they were there, in every corner of the palace. Trusted beyond family, feared beyond soldiers. Men made into servants not by training, but by blade. They were allowed near the queen's quarters, near the harem, near the children of the empire, because they were believed to be safe. Deprived of desire. Denied legacy. Shaped to serve, not to disrupt. In the carvings of Persepolis, they stand at attention. Smooth-cheeked, clean-robed, lips sealed. They whisper into the ears of kings. They pour wine. They relay orders. They punish. But what the carvings never show, is what the blade took. What the records never ask, is whether every eunuch began as a boy. You see, Persian scribes were methodical, each decree, every battle, every tax recorded. But when it came to the body, to gender, to anatomy, silence. The word eunuch became a cloak, covering everything from castrated boys to gender non-conforming servants, to those whose existence blurred the empire's rigid lines. A man who could not sire children. Eunuch. A woman who could no longer bleed. Eunuch. A person neither male nor female, refashioned by force or ritual. Also, eunuch. There are strange lines in later Zoroastrian legal codes. Mentions of the barren ones, those with secret scars, or servants of the sacred who must not marry. Their pronouns shift. Their duties are feminine, yet their status is not. These are not accidents. They are cover-ups, hidden in plain sight. And in rare foreign accounts, Greek envoys, Roman prisoners, there are vague mentions of beardless women in male robes, soft-voiced keepers of the royal veil, and those who once were girls, now serving as ghosts among the king's guard. But the Persian court never explained. It didn't need to. It built walls of gold and history of omission. Because to explain them would mean to admit what was done. And silence is easier to maintain than truth. So we kept learning names like Xerxes, Darius, and Cyrus. We learned about their roads, their battles, their coins. But not the ones who stood beside them, silent, reshaped, renamed. How many of us have studied Persia, and never once heard this story? If we're going to remember empires, let's remember the forgotten, too. If you believe silence is a form of violence, subscribe to Tale of History now. They were not meant to be remembered. That was the point. The Persian Empire, like many before and after, excelled at selective memory. Glorify the monarchs. Canonize the warriors. Immortalize the conquerors in bas-reliefs and gold-leafed manuscripts. But those who served quietly in the margins, their names were not etched in stone. Their lives were collateral, and easily erased. And yet, if you search the shadows between records, if you trace the strange silences in history's voice, they emerge. In fragmented texts from Islamic scholars centuries later, there are whispers. Some speak of Gilmanat, feminized servants of the court, neither fully women nor men, cloaked in obedience and restructured by design. In rare corners of commentary, there are mentions of those whose femininity was taken, but whose service remained. But the language is cautious. Euphemistic. As though speaking of these figures too plainly might contaminate the sanctity of the empire. Greek visitors to Persia. Herodotus among them, described strange sights in the royal courts, attendants who moved with the grace of women but wore the garments of men, whose eyes never met those of nobles, and whose voices were softer than wind. One fragment tells of a chamber guard, cloaked and veiled, who bled once, but no longer, serving not as concubine but as keeper of the wombs of kings. What were they? Who were they? Theories abound, pieced together like bones without names. Some may have been women punished through forced genital mutilation, stripped not just of agency, but of identity. Others could have been intersex individuals, born outside the empire's gendered binaries and forced into roles that required bodily modification to align with the state's expectations. Still more may have been enslaved women, forced to dress as men, altered physically or chemically to serve in male-dominated spheres without risk of compromising royal bloodlines. Their lives were contradictions. They existed to be invisible, to serve but not be seen, to protect but never to speak. They guarded the harems, the living museums of the king's power, yet could not partake in the joys, the vanity, or the sisterhood of womanhood. They moved between rooms like shadows, carrying secrets in the folds of their silence. Some were used as religious instruments, caretakers of sacred fires, or ritual attendants in temple complexes. Their liminality, their altered bodies, made them pure in a twisted theological logic, beyond temptation, beyond gender, and therefore perfect vessels for divine service. Others were deployed as emissaries, spies, or message bearers. They passed through territories undetected, their presence unthreatening, their absence unrecorded. But when they died, they left behind no tombs. No inscriptions. No epics. Their names were dust before the body was cold. Because what do you write on the grave of someone you refuse to admit ever lived? And so they remained, genderless servants in gendered courts, their blood washed away by palace rituals and their suffering sealed in state silence. We honor generals and kings with statues, bronze colossi that stretch toward the heavens. But not one carved stone for these women. Not one name remembered. If you believe that dignity isn't reserved for the powerful, hit subscribe to Tale of History. If not, tell us why you think their stories don't deserve to be told. There are no ceremonies for mutilation. No trumpets. No scrolls. No prayers. Only linen soaked in blood, and the sound of a name being unspoken forever. In ancient Persia, the act of castration was not a sentence, it was a system. A ritual cloaked in silence, wrapped in necessity, and buried in statecraft. And while the mutilation of boys to make eunuchs has been discussed, debated, and even dissected across centuries, the cutting of women has not. Not in detail. Not in comfort. Not without shame. Because to strip a woman of her reproductive organs, to surgically erase her womb, her bloodline, her right to lineage, was not just an act of power. It was annihilation masked as obedience. What we do know, comes to us in fragments. The 11th century physician Avicenna, called Ibn Sina in Persia, catalogued hundreds of surgical methods and medical cases in his canon of medicine. Hidden deep within his anatomical notes are passing references to abdominal incisions in women rendered barren by necessity, cauterizations of the inner body to end blood and temptation, and procedures administered upon the unwilling and voiceless. He does not name them. He does not explain who ordered these acts. But the descriptions are too precise to be myth. The practice, if real, would have been both brutal and absolute. Anesthesia was crude at best, opium smoke or soaked rags. Restraints were physical. Screams were muffled. Incisions were deep. In some cases, it is theorized that the uterus was either removed or destroyed. In others, the aim was less about biology and more about transformation, chemical sterilization using mercury, forced fasting, or long-term isolation designed to halt menstruation and weaken the body's cycles. The result was the same, a woman made safe. Safe from pregnancy. Safe from desire. Safe from being seen as a woman at all. But this was not a Persian invention. It was part of a global horror. In China, young boys destined for imperial service had their genitals removed entirely, without exception, without mercy. In the Ottoman court, black African boys were castrated on mass scale, their survival rates so low that cemeteries were dug before the blades touched flesh. In the Byzantine Empire, eunuchs were prized for their supposed purity, elevated as saints and singers, but made so through trauma. And yet, Persia's silence on female eunuchs may be the darkest of all. Because it was a silence built on shame. The act itself was not recorded. The victim was not named. The procedure was not sanctified. It simply happened. In rooms draped in silk, behind doors guarded by men with knives, beneath the floors of palaces where queens gave birth to heirs, others bled, and no one asked why. They were not given the dignity of recovery. They were not permitted grief. Their new identity was not celebrated. It was assigned. And from that moment on, they became instruments of empire. Their pain did not end. It was institutionalized. Their blood became part of the foundation, unseen, but permanent. And even today, history does not speak of them. They bled in silence, erased from lineage, motherhood, and memory. If that doesn't deserve 1 second of your attention, or a single click of support, then say so in the comments. We dare you. Power, in ancient Persia, rarely wore its own face. It hid behind veils, behind titles, behind bloodlines and rituals, but more often, behind people. Figures who moved through the court like smoke, present in every chamber, yet never seen in the full light of day. Whisperers. Advisors. Eyes for the king. Ears for the queen. Shadows with voices sharper than blades. Among these shadows were the eunuchs. Some we know, at least in outline. Bagoas, the powerful court eunuch who orchestrated poisonings and palace alliances, served as kingmaker and confidant in the late Achaemenid court. He controlled access to Darius III, commanded armies indirectly, and could bend the will of kings with a whisper. Greek historians sneered at his influence, but they feared it, too. And yet, Bagoas is always referred to as a man. A eunuch, yes, but unmistakably male. But what if, not all of them were? What if one or more of these quiet giants of courtly manipulation was not male at all, but a woman, cut, cloaked, and reintroduced as something new? A figure whose power was conditional on her invisibility? A ghost in the palace hierarchy? It wouldn't be without precedent. Persian courts were sophisticated systems of surveillance and secrecy. Access was everything. To control who stood near the king was to control the throne itself. Eunuchs, because they were presumed to have no ambition for dynasty, no threat of sexual betrayal, became the perfect instruments of trust. And what better place to conceal a woman, than in the body of someone no one dares question? There are fragments, barely noticed, that suggest the possibility. An advisor to Artaxerxes II described in a Babylonian tablet as soft-handed and veiled, but fierce in counsel. A Zoroastrian temple servant known only as the Clear One, who passed judgments among nobles in a voice never heard publicly. In later Islamic retellings, there are stories of a eunuch priest who wore perfume favored by women, walked with an uneven gait, and could not be left alone with the queen, not for fear of seduction, but for fear of familiarity. We have no names. We have no images. Only footprints that appear briefly in the dust, and then vanish. But imagine her. Imagine a girl. Perhaps taken young, perhaps from a noble line fallen into disgrace. Her body altered, her future rewritten by decree. No longer daughter. Not son. Not even servant. Something else. A vessel. A function. And now, she stands behind the king's throne. Quiet, deliberate. She delivers secrets between generals, monitors the queen's rivals, listens to gossip from the harem, speaks to foreign emissaries with a face they don't recognize but never forget. She advises on diplomacy with a precision that unnerves men who think themselves masters of the state. No one questions her. She is not a woman. Not to them. She is a tool. A trusted relic. A part of the palace, like marble or gold. But inside? She remembers. Every cut. Every silence. Every moment where the world taught her she was not meant to rule. And now? She rules more than they know. History may not have remembered her name. But power did. Because power never cared what was between her legs. It only cared what was behind her eyes. And isn't that what haunts us most? That in the stories we tell about kings and bloodlines, we ignore the ones who truly moved the levers of history. The ones who had no sons, no tombs, no titles, only influence. Only strategy. Only survival. You say you love history. But do you only love the winners? The loud ones? The men? Subscribe to Tale of History if you're here for more than just blood and crowns. If not, explain your reasoning below, we're listening. Erasure doesn't happen with fire. Not always. Sometimes it happens with ink. With silence. With the careful stroke of a pen that chooses not to write, or chooses to write differently. When you scan the ancient sources, Islamic chronicles, Greek commentaries, colonial translations, you'll find eunuchs mentioned, often with unease, sometimes with contempt, occasionally with admiration. But even when they appear, something vital is missing. The women. They're there, of course, between the lines. Coded. Masked. Mistranslated. Disfigured not just in life, but in memory. The early Islamic historians who inherited the Persian imperial legacy had little interest in preserving its more uncomfortable truths. Eunuchs were acknowledged, sometimes praised for loyalty, sometimes condemned as unmanly or corrupting. But those who did not fit neatly into the binary of male eunuch or female concubine, they were blurred out. Their gender made ambiguous. Their roles made vague. Their pronouns bent until they cracked under the weight of imposed modesty. Greek historians were no better. They viewed Persia through the lens of decadence and distortion. To them, any figure not defined by male conquest or female submission was a curiosity. Eunuchs were described as half-men, as emasculated monsters, or as moral warnings. But those who were born female and then altered, those who chose to pass through the court's golden gates in silence, they were ignored. Or worse, rewritten. In one fragment from a Hellenistic traveler's diary, there is mention of a veiled figure with a voice like water and a gaze too sharp for a slave, who was said to speak for the queen mother and the king's treasurer alike. But in later translations, the gender of the figure shifts, from she to it, then to he, and finally, to nothing at all. Colonial scholars, centuries later, were perhaps the final blade. Armed with Victorian morality and a Western obsession with classification, they combed through Persian and Islamic texts with one goal: to create a clean, legible history. A history where every eunuch was male, every woman was passive, and every deviation from gender norms was either pathology or fiction. They translated words not as they were written, but as they expected to find them. A term that might have meant woman altered by state decree was softened into domestic aid. A phrase implying one without womb or beard became a courtier of low rank. Descriptions of femininity were either eroticized or erased. Even the language conspired. Persian, like many languages, sometimes defaults to masculine forms in the absence of a specified gender. In bureaucratic texts, in religious commentaries, in oral traditions later committed to script, gendered pronouns faded into a sea of neutrality, or worse, false masculinity. So the stories were not just forgotten. They were rewritten. Until what had once been a body, a voice, a life, became a footnote. Then a whisper. Then a gap. And here is the cruelest irony: eunuchs, by design, were feminized. Mocked for their softness, their lack of virility, their unmanliness. And yet, the moment the subject may have actually been a woman, or once had a womb, the chroniclers turned away. Suddenly, there was no room for femininity in the record. No space for altered womanhood. No acknowledgement that pain, too, could be female. Because to admit that women were mutilated by states, that they were used to prop up regimes, that they were hidden inside roles crafted for the voiceless, would mean confronting how empire did not merely forget women. It manufactured their disappearance. This is not the past misremembering. It is the past choosing to forget. So when you read the chronicles, when you marvel at the maps, when you trace the bloodlines of kings and the conquests of empires, ask yourself, what stories did the ink erase? And whose hands held the pen? If these women were powerful enough to be silenced, they were powerful enough to be remembered. Subscribe to Tale of History, because if we don't write them back into the story, then the silence wins. What remains? After the manuscripts have rotted. After the bones have turned to dust. After the voices have been swallowed by centuries of sanctioned silence. What's left? A shadow. A whisper, caught in the folds of an old poem. A name that doesn't match its title. A structure with no known builder, but a carved signature that ends in a woman's hand. Persian history, though scrubbed by the empires that followed, left behind fragments too stubborn to fade. In poetry, where law could not reach, and the tongue could dance with danger, hints survive. The mystics wrote of those with no sons and no lovers, who heard the words of fire in the stillness of night. The lovers' poems mention the veiled one who knew both silence and steel. In the Shahnameh, the great Persian epic, there is a curious line. She who was made not to bleed, yet watched over the lineage of kings. Some say it was metaphor. But what if it wasn't? In oral traditions passed down by women in the highlands of Yazd and the valleys of Fars, there are stories, half lullaby, half warning, of guardians with soft eyes and hollow bellies, who kept the peace in sacred places, who answered to no husband, who bled only once in their lives, and never again. And then, there is the fire. Zoroastrian temples, long before the rise of Islam, once housed attendants not bound by family or lineage. The priesthood, though officially male-dominated, included figures described as pure vessels, their bodies altered to preserve their neutrality. Some scholars now believe these may have included women, or something between what the empire was willing to name. There are architectural ghosts, too. In Persepolis, a small antechamber near the Hall of 100 Columns bears graffiti far older than the conquest of Alexander. Among the crude etchings of horses and bows, one stands out, a stylized figure with no beard, no breasts, arms lifted in supplication, beneath an inscription roughly translating to Keeper of the Queens. The glyph used for the title is feminine. The figure itself, unplaceable. At Naqsh-e Rustam, the tombs of kings pierce the cliffs like sealed mouths. But nearby, there's a smaller shrine, its entrance worn down, forgotten in maps, unnamed in guides. And inside, a weathered relief of a figure draped in ceremonial robes, flanked by both male and female attendants. No weapons. No crown. Just a hand resting on a scroll, and eyes that refuse to look away. Who was she? Who carved her? Why did no one preserve her name? Perhaps they feared what she represented, not a woman. Not a man. But something the empire made. Something it needed. And hated for needing. These fragments, scattered across landscape and legend, are all we have left. They don't form a full picture. They don't bring her back. But they refuse to disappear. And that matters. Because for all the effort spent erasing her, for all the hands that turned her into a pronoun, a footnote, a myth, something still remains. A name, maybe. Hidden. Unspoken. But real. And if we find it, if we speak it, we are not just restoring memory. We are undoing erasure. We are refusing to let history be neat. We are letting the ruins speak. Because she never got a monument. She never got a lineage. She never got to live as a woman, or die as one. But she existed. And that alone makes her worth remembering. Subscribe to Tale of History if you're here not for legends, but for the truth that lies beneath them. Because even in ruins, she remains. Stand in front of the mirror. Not the one in your home. Not the one that flatters. The other one. The mirror that history holds up when no one is looking. The one that doesn't show your reflection, but reveals what has been carved out of it. What do you see? A woman? A man? Something in between? Or something completely unspoken? Now ask yourself, who gets to decide which bodies matter? Who chooses whose pain gets remembered, and whose gets redacted? In ancient Persia, that decision was made long before the blade touched skin. It was made in stone courts and fire temples, in law books and language, in traditions where a body's worth depended on whether it could reproduce, or rule. Today, we imagine ourselves distant from that brutality. We no longer cut in silence. We no longer erase names by decree. But we still measure womanhood in blood, in birth, in the binaries empires created to control. Still, records leave people out. Still, names are changed, or omitted altogether. Still, entire identities are softened into shadows because the truth is too inconvenient, too complex, too unruly. And when we write history, we do it again. We retell the lives of men who built kingdoms and rewrote borders, while the stories of those who bled quietly behind curtains, those who were reshaped, renamed, and repurposed, go missing, line by line. We ask, where were the women? But only if they were queens, mothers, wives. Not if they were servants with scars. Not if they were altered, hidden, and forced to survive inside the lie of usefulness. How much of womanhood is erased when it doesn't serve power? How many of our modern frameworks, our laws, our categories, our definitions, are built on the same machinery of omission? The same language that once labeled a mutilated girl a safe companion, a courtier, a faithful shadow. We inherited that silence. And unless we drag it into the light, we'll pass it on. This story is not about ancient Persia. It's about us. It's about the lives we still find inconvenient. The truths we still bury in euphemism. The voices we still fail to hear until it's too late to answer back. You say we live in a modern world. But if a body still needs to fit a category to be remembered, if a woman must still prove her worth through reproduction or obedience, if the in-between are still invisible unless they suffer loud enough, then we are still in the palace. Still walking the same halls. Still averting our eyes when the blade comes down. If they were erased once, they can be erased again. And if we don't tell their stories now, they'll vanish forever. Subscribe to Tale of History. Or tell us why it's better they stay forgotten. We'll wait. This was never just about ancient Persia. It was never just about queens, kings, temples, or thrones. It was about the space between the names. The gaps in the scrolls. The bodies that served but were never seen. The women, born or made, who were folded into silence by power that needed them, but never wanted them remembered. And it's not just ancient. It never was. Because every time we ask who built an empire, every time we marvel at battles, dynasties, gold, and glory, we make a choice. To remember the loud. To elevate the winners. To immortalize the visible. And to bury the rest. But history didn't forget them by accident. It was instructed to. Their names were not lost, they were erased. Their voices not unheard. They were silenced. Their suffering wasn't a side note, it was the structure beneath the throne. So if we remember only the ones with crowns, we become the empire that cut them down. But if we choose to remember the broken, the hidden, the unnamed, then we break the pattern. We tell the truth. And we give history back its missing heart. At Tale of History, we don't just tell stories, we rescue the erased. Join us. Or justify why you won't. Your voice matters. So does your silence.